Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Byron, and I have the honor of serving as the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I want to welcome you to the Nixon Library for another of our Distinguished Speakers Series programs. I want to begin this evening by thanking all the members of the Richard Nixon Foundation, if you're a member in our audience, or if you're watching online as we are live streaming tonight's program. Your support ensures that more programs like this can happen. These are programs that stimulate and enhance civic involvement and civic interest, and I would encourage anyone watching or anyone in the audience today to join us, become a member, and you can sign up at nixonfoundation.org. Now on to our speaker this evening. Beginning at the very outset of his presidency, President Nixon responded to one of the most important and pressing issues of the late 1960s, and that is environmental protection in America. Rivers were literally catching on fire as a result of overpollution. President Nixon instituted many of the most consequential environmental reforms in America's history. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, signed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. He created the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the list goes on and on and on. The results have been nothing less than transformative. He has balanced government action with market-based solutions. And here to talk to us about those reforms and how a Nixonian approach to environmentalism should be our nation's blueprint today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the Nixon Library Benji Backer. Benji is the founder and the executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, the largest right-of-center environmental organization in the United States. He is a leading voice for market-based, sensible environmental policies and reforms, and has been invited to share his views in testimony before the United States Congress. He is a member of Bridge USA, the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Climate Change Commission. His recognition includes being named to the Fortune 40 Under 40, Forbes' 30 Under 30, Green Biz 30 Under 30, and Grist 50 lists. He's an avid hiker, and he spends as much time as he can outdoors in the mountains of the western United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Benji Backer.
Good evening. How are we? So, I am here 50 years after Richard Nixon, I believe, was the best environmental president in United States history. And tonight I want to share with you how we can use his leadership as a guide for how to move forward in America going forward. But before we get started into that, a little bit about me. So you're like, what is this guy who can't grow facial hair, young guy standing up front, talking to you about the environment? I started what is now the biggest grassroots environmental organization on the right, called the American Conservation Coalition. We have over 50,000 members across the country in over 200 chapters. The reason I started that organization is after 16 years of political activism, I'm 26 now, so if you do the math, I got started pretty early. After 16 years of political activism, a few years ago I realized that my love of the environment was seemingly at odds with my political beliefs. I am an avid hiker, avid skier, like Jim said, and I really felt like my party was leaving me behind on the environment. To me, the environment has no political home. To me, the environment is something that both sides should work together to accomplish results on, and I believe to my core that nature is nonpartisan. I grew up in Wisconsin, in rural Wisconsin, surrounded by beautiful lakes and trees and places that I recreated at a young age. And I also grew up in a part of Wisconsin that was fairly rural. My high school was across the street from a dairy farm, and that was the sort of world that I grew up in. So I understood why people were skeptical of modern day environmentalism, but I myself really wanted to work hard to protect it. And the thing that ties me the most to Richard Nixon isn't my love of the environment, it's this fact. It's that we both light up when we hear about national parks. That's something that is written about a lot with Richard Nixon, and it's something that really has inspired my work in the American Conservation Coalition and the book that I wrote, and so on. But when I'm in those places, and I think Richard Nixon would have said the same, the political identity doesn't matter. It's about the protection of those places. And so when I started ACC, there were 2 Republicans in Congress who believed in climate change and were doing something about it. Today, there are over 150 who are on the record saying that climate change is real and that we need to do something about it. And so my life is dedicated to making these issues nonpartisan again. But I also have a problem with where the environmental community is heading as well. And I feel like we're at a similar crossroads to where President Nixon was in the 1970s. He had a quote, "The great question of the 70s is, shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?" And he followed that up with a legacy that is honestly really hard to even talk about because there's so much there. Like I said, I believe wholeheartedly that Richard Nixon is the best environmental president in the United States' history, which is hard for me to say because Teddy Roosevelt is my personal hero. But I do think that Nixon's legacy is among the best, if not the best. His policy record is founding the EPA, which I do want to give a quick shout out to one of my mentors, Dan Evans, who created the Department of Ecology in Washington, which was used as the model for the EPA, Republican governor up in Washington. I know that was possible back then. Richard Nixon founded NOAA. He founded the Council on Environmental Quality, which is an important position within the White House with each administration. He signed the Endangered Species Act, the Mammal Protection Act, the Clean Air Act. He created the Legacy of Parks program, which created 642 new parks in the United States. He also declared the first ever Earth Day in the United States. That doesn't sound like a Republican in today's world, but that's the Republican of the future that I envision. But he also did that in a divided political climate, not that much different than what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with one of the worst political, some of the worst political division we've seen in recent history, but he worked across the aisle to get things done. And in fact, 1/3 of America believed in pollution was a serious problem when he started one of his terms in office, and by the end of the term, 70% believed that pollution was a serious problem. So not only was he working in a divisive political climate, he also changed the narrative of Americans. Sierra Club's membership tripled during his time in office. But there was something about him that makes him unique, and I think really allowed him to be an amazing leader on this issue. It's that he was incredibly skeptical of the environmental movement itself. In a private meeting with Henry Ford II, who obviously was a very important leader at the time, Nixon said environmental predictions were greatly exaggerated, and he blasted environmentalists for wanting humans to go back and live like a bunch of damned animals. That doesn't sound like something someone would say when they have the legacy that Richard Nixon has. But the reason he said that was because he knew environmental protection was not an option, but environmental protection at the expense of humanity also wasn't an option. And that's where he found the sweet spot to get things done. Unfortunately, we are trending towards that fear that he had of environmentalists wanting humans to go back and live like a bunch of damned animals, and it's feeding into our political divide, which I'll touch on in a second. But the reason why it seems impossible for Richard Nixon to be a Republican leading on these things in today's world is that 40% of Americans see themselves as environmentalists today. Back in the time when Richard Nixon was leading on this, it was near 85%. The partisanship on this issue, the divide on this issue, the way that it's entered our culture wars has turned Americans against each other on the very issue that we should be united on. And I do not believe that Richard Nixon could be successful in today's political climate to do what he needed to do. So what does that mean? There are leaders like Richard Nixon out there who can't accomplish the right things for our environment or our economy or all the things I'm going to touch on because of the toxic political divide that we're seeing on the issue. At its core, we need to solve for the fact that only 40% of Americans see themselves as environmentalists. And a story, I was speaking to a group of mostly older conservatives in Washington State, in rural Washington State, and I asked the crowd, when I saw the statistic, I decided to ask the crowd, who here considers themselves an environmentalist? Probably a group of 400 people. 3 hands went up. When I said who here considered themselves an environmentalist in 1980, every single hand went up in the crowd. So, what isn't working? What has turned people away from environmentalism? I, unfortunately, as I'm standing here in California, would like to say that the California approach is what's not working. That approach is mandates, rules, and regulations. And I want to talk about a few facts that, unfortunately, the governor doesn't want to hear. The first is on energy. The prices of energy in California, as you know in this room, are double the national average. It's not very cool. 93% of the natural gas that California uses is imported, and 75% of the crude oil is imported. 59% of that, to throw some more statistics at you, is from outside the United States. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Ecuador, Colombia, and Nigeria are the countries and the imports that are the largest for California's fossil fuels. The rest come from the United States or Canada. That's all happening on the heels of multiple administrations, but especially the most recent one, planning to shut down the largest clean energy source in the state, the nuclear power plant of Diablo Canyon. 10% of California's power comes from this one clean energy source, and they wanted to take that away. As a result of that and other mandates towards shutting down nuclear and natural gas, mandates on EVs and solar and wind, obviously demand is increasing for energy. I was touring a Utah coal plant a couple years ago, right when Governor Newsom was in his first term, and they told me, little do Californians know that 80% of our coal power is sent to California every night so that people can power their homes and businesses when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. Obviously, Diablo Canyon was threatened to shut down, was planned fully to shut down. I toured that a few weeks ago. I'm still alive, according to myself. But also, the attacks that are, I could go into that, and we can go into that in Q&A, but the attacks on that are completely unfettered. Arizona, where I live today, we ship a lot of our nuclear power to California because, again, California can't survive the energy demand on the grid. Okay, so energy, not really working, okay? Emissions are going up, fossil fuels are being imported from other countries, and instead of the United States or California itself, and as a result, the environment's not protected and energy prices are double the national average. Does that sound like a working strategy to you? I'm 26, but I've lived long enough to say no. Okay, forest fires. Governor Newsom's first 3 summers as governor were the worst forest fire summers since the early 1900s, when we don't know what we were doing with forests. One summer of forest fires, a few summers ago, as you probably remember if you lived here back then, undid the entire carbon emissions reductions that the state had made with its energy changes. Over 12 years was wiped out by one summer of forest fires in California alone. In the first term of Governor Newsom's time in office, it cost California taxpayers $120 billion in damages. $120 billion, okay? $60 billion in income was lost as well, just during the first term in California of Governor Newsom being in office. And that's according to a climate organization in California who endorses him. Governor Newsom has had this hands-off approach with forests, where he says, we aren't going to manage our forests. We're not going to take care of them. We're not going to even listen to the Native American tribes that know how to manage the forests. We're going to basically do nothing and let them burn, and we're going to blame it on climate change, which, as I'll get into in a little bit, I do believe in climate change, and I'm still, any scientist would say that Governor Newsom's lying when it comes to that, and that, in fact, the emissions coming from the forest fires that he's not preventing, and the state government's not preventing, because it's not just him, it's decades of problems, are overshadowing every carbon emissions target that you could ever make and actually contributing to climate change because of the bad forest management. Okay, so he's really bad, and the state's really bad on energy and forest fires. Well, California's also top 5 in water usage per capita. It's not very good in a fairly dry state. Rural communities, farmers, and low-income communities are completely left out of the dialogue. And businesses are fleeing the state because they don't want to do business here. In fact, I was meeting with the executive of the only American company to process rare earth materials a few months ago, and he told me about a solar mining company, or a mining company that feeds the materials for our solar panels that is in California. They're mining in California, but they're shipping the materials to China to process them because they can't process them here in California because it's too difficult and too expensive, and then it's coming right back here. Doesn't seem very efficient, does it? I was also touring the nation's only no driver, no car city or no car, no driver neighborhood community. It's called Cul-de-sac, and it's in Tempe, Arizona. Now, if you've ever been to Arizona, you know that it's a little bit of an urban sprawl. So how could the first community that doesn't have drivers and cars be in Tempe? Well, I asked them that, and they said that they wanted to do it here in California because the culture and the people tend to care a lot more about the environment and be more conscious, and people would love to sign up for something like that. But that the regulatory structure and the barriers were too large in California, that they would put California last on their list to start the business in, so they chose Arizona instead. Thank you. We love that. And that place is filled up. It just opened about 6 months ago, and it's a completely full community. And yet, all these facts that I'm sending your way, probably a little overwhelming, but the state continues to blame everyone else for its problems. And what it shows, even though I'm sure these issues are complex, it's not just California that's at fault, it's not just Governor Newsom. This approach is focused on mandates, rules, and regulations, and that's been the equivalent of stifled innovation and environmental harm and degradation. Unfortunately, the national approach isn't much better. You can see Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC debating in Congress, and you don't have to spend too much time to realize that the national approach on really any issue isn't going too well right now. But unlike in history, when people could put their petty grievances aside on the environment and solve problems during some of the most divisive times, those days have passed. And so instead, the environment is used as a political football now to create polarization and lead to tribalism. And what I call in the book that I wrote called The Conservative Environmentalist is this alarmism versus denial. You have one side saying that the world's all going to end by 2030, and you have the other side saying that we don't need to solve these issues at all. You have one side saying that we should ban fossil fuels, and you have another side saying that fossil fuels are the only energy source that we should embrace, and that we should just drill, baby, drill. You have the Inflation Reduction Act passing on completely partisan lines. There wasn't a single Republican who voted for it. There wasn't a single Democrat who voted against it. And then you have the other side passing on party lines some of the biggest investments to bail out the oil and gas industry in recent history. That political football polarization is destroying our environment, but it's also destroying the way that we live our lives. And it's led to us not being able to solve very simple problems. If Republicans and Democrats could have come together on the Endangered Species Act when Richard Nixon was president, how come there have been no amendments to the Endangered Species Act since 1982? Why have there been no amendments to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act in a bipartisan way since then either? It's because the inaction and the division has created more power for the government to create control on these policies rather than create results, with very well-meaning policies that were very relevant at the time. But they have no methods to achieve those results. The Endangered Species Act has delisted 3% of the animals that it's listed under the Endangered Species Act policy. I don't think Richard Nixon would be very proud of that number, but it's not his fault. The division and the inaction and the radicalism that has prevented us from adapting to new technologies, to new ideas, to new policies, has prevented really critical species from being saved. On top of that, because we don't get anything done in this country, we've exported all of the getting things done to China. 90% of our EVs and wind and solar come from, solar EV materials come from China. And we import uranium fuel from Russia because we can't do it here in the United States. We used to create enough uranium fuel for nuclear power in the United States to power our entire nuclear fleet. We now do about 5%. Russia and Kazakhstan, who is in bed with China and Russia, are doing the rest. So I think back to, and I promise it's about to get positive, but I think it's important to set the stage first. Hubert Hefner, the deputy director of Nixon's administration of Office of Science and Technology, said something that I think was way before his time, because it's actually coming to fruition now. The more I get into this, the more I find two classes of doomsayers, with, of course, the silent majority in between, referring to the alarmists and the deniers. He said that 50 plus years ago, and he predicted the reality that we're facing today, because now we are actually at the crossroads of those two extremes, because they've both taken hold of political power, and it's created stagnation and inaction that is ruining our country. As a result, Nixon's environmental legacy, which is also America's environmental legacy, is itself a critically endangered species. And the crossroads has bigger implications than just the environment. So it's weakening our national security, our economy, our energy reliability, and our communities, and it's playing into the worsening political divide that's tearing our country apart right now. As President Nixon said, the use of our resources of the sea and the land in a more effective way, and with more concern for preserving the beauty and the natural resources, are so important to any kind of society that we want for the future. Because one of the reasons that he said that, and the reason that he led on the environment, is because he knew that leading on the environment had more of an implication than just saving the polar bears and helping the environment. It had a relationship with the rest of the country and the future of this country. So, if we're at that crossroads and everything sucks, because it kind of does right now, where do we go from here? And that's what I really want people to take away from tonight. I believe, and tonight I'm going to call on a modern era version of Nixon's environmentalism, because I think that we can learn a lot from his leadership. And there are things that I outlined in my book that even before preparing for this presentation, I didn't realize that he had led so effectively on, even though I mentioned it a lot in the book. And there's a few key attributes that have led his policies to be successful and the things that I think we can have for the future. The first is that I think we need to embrace an evolutionary approach rather than a revolutionary approach. What I mean by that is anybody who knows psychology or human behavior knows that when you try to overhaul things and rush people to decisions, they don't really like that. If you said you need to get your 12 to-do list items done by tomorrow, otherwise you're getting fired, people would be paralyzed and not get anything done. But if you say we need you to get this one thing done, they're probably going to do it. Not only do we need to have policies that reflect that, we need to reflect that in terms of not rushing to EVs, not rushing to solar and wind. We need to start moving people step by step. We also need to make these solutions better for people in their day-to-day lives. The example that I want to use is the BlackBerry cell phone. If anyone saw the documentary, or somewhat documentary, of the BlackBerry demise, the reason why the BlackBerry failed wasn't because it was a bad product. It was because the Apple product was so much better. It was so much better, it was about the similar cost, and it improved people's lives. So everyone wanted to adopt it. When we think about environmentalism, we need to have that same lens. How do we improve people's lives, make it easier for them to live their lives, and not ask them to spend more money? So, evolution, not revolution. A revolutionary approach doesn't make it possible for humans to be a part of the solution, and it also turns people away from having any benefit in their day-to-day lives. The second principle that was embraced by President Nixon was leaning on innovation rather than regulation, and markets rather than mandates. So people say, oh no, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the EPA, those are big government policies. It was using government to work with private industry to find solutions. It wasn't meant to be a one-size-fits-all, the government takes over the control of people's lives. It was a way for the government to work with the innovators and the people who were trying to make the world a cleaner place. And when you set up the structure where the government isn't dictating the answers, the private sector is, you actually get more answers and more bang for your buck. A perfect example of this is actually the hybrid. The first hybrid, as we can probably remember, to really make it on the market was the Toyota Prius. And we all have a stereotype of who drives a Toyota Prius. If anyone's in the crowd, I apologize for that, but you probably fit that stereotype. There's nothing wrong with it. I also drive a hybrid. But the reason the Prius took off was not because of government mandate. In fact, the government here was trying to create objectives to have low fuel, or more fuel efficient vehicles by the year 2000, and they were mandating that the automakers create those technologies. The automakers were just sputtering. They didn't really know what to do. They didn't know how to make it that quickly. And over on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, Japan had an incentive program where it was literally just the market saying, we want more fuel-efficient vehicles, and Toyota said, heck, we could sell more vehicles by creating a Toyota Prius and have people save money and give them a vehicle they like to drive. Let's do it. They created it in a system where there was no government intervention while we were sputtering here in the United States, and then we're trying to catch up this many decades later. Electric vehicles are a perfect example of that as well. If you look at the companies that have done the best on EVs, it's the ones that have been successful outside of the government being involved. Even Elon Musk has been very open about the government's role in Tesla being successful and says that it wasn't really that helpful because what they're subsidizing is a lot of the same old, and they don't really subsidize innovation. And he went above and beyond to create the biggest electric vehicle brand in the United States because of technology and innovation, not because of government regulation. Another example of this that I think is really fun is 4Ocean. If you've ever heard of it, it's an organization that has saved and taken out 35 million pounds of trash from the ocean. 35 million pounds of trash from the ocean. And it's a private sector effort that was created from technology and innovation in a way that the government would never have been able to do, and they have the ability to do it across different country boundaries. Another principle that Richard Nixon embraced was this any of the above solution. Now, we always hear people say all of the above energy, or we need to pick winners and losers so that we can have a cleaner economy. Well, he said, we just need reliable and affordable energy, and we should be doing it as cleanly as we can. He even said that we should have 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000, which would have been really nice. I wouldn't be up here right now if that was successful, not because the world would have ended, but because a lot of these problems wouldn't exist if we had 1,000 nuclear plants. But there are 2 states in the United States that are embracing that agenda and showing that it can still work today as it did for Richard Nixon, in Wyoming and Georgia. Georgia and Wyoming are starting to lead the country in reducing carbon emissions. They have Republican governors. They've passed multiple policies across party lines with Democrats and Republicans that have embraced any technology to come into their state that will help solve these problems. Nuclear, you're welcome. EVs, you're welcome here. Hybrids, you're welcome here. Internal combustion vehicles, you're welcome. Oil, solar, wind, you're welcome here. We are not going to stop you from being here. And so, those 2 states are bringing home a lot of the manufacturing and industry that America needs while also reducing emissions. And I'm sure the governors are very happy about the economic development that is not fleeing their state, it's fleeing to their state. When you have the any of the above strategy, you also get to work with unlikely stakeholders. I've spent a lot of time with oil and coal workers in Texas, New Mexico, Utah, and these are people that are proud to be a part of powering people's lives and to have been doing that for decades, but they're ready to change, and they're ready to be a part of the solution. If they can help reduce emissions on fossil fuels that they're continuing to use, they want to be a part of that. They want to be invested in carbon capture and other ideas that can keep their industry alive, their communities alive, without ripping their community away. They just want to keep their family in those places. And a perfect example of not picking winners and losers in the any of the above strategy is the United States imperfectly choosing that and reducing emissions more than any other country in the world. We've not reduced emissions more than any other country in the world because of mandates and regulations and because we've mandated solar and wind here in California, But it happened because natural gas was the alternative to coal, and that's 60% cleaner than coal. And so America has led the world in reducing emissions because that's a pretty hefty amount of emissions. And when you aren't picking winners and losers and you aren't trying to find a silver bullet solution, you can make a lot of progress, and Richard Nixon knew that. One of the other principles that Richard Nixon embraced with his environmental agenda was a community-first, government-last approach. So what I mean by that is the government's not out of the equation. It's not some libertarian, the government shouldn't be involved at all. It's just, why are we going to the government first to solve these problems? Why don't we go community first, then county, state, then federal if we really need to? Because local people know how to take care of their environments and their communities better than anyone else. A perfect example of this is the Republican governor of Alabama teaming up with the Nature Conservancy, predominantly left-of-center environmental organization, which also teamed up with duck hunters in Louisiana to restore the entire coast of Louisiana so that duck hunters could still hunt their ducks and that climate change mitigation and adaptation measures could be taken. Different reasons for the same result, but it was local knowledge, and if a government bureaucrat tried to do that, they would have failed. Another perfect example of this is my home state of Wisconsin. I toured a farm in Wisconsin that was taking poop from cows, which was very gross, and turning it to renewable natural gas. And it was a climate venture out of Boston that was funded from a lot of the elite universities that people would think of as left-of-center universities, that was funding an incentive and giving farmers an extra layer of income to turn their poop, which they don't want anyways, into power for people in a low-emissions way, because that poop was going to go into the atmosphere anyways, unfortunately. Another example of it that I saw recently was TerraPower. TerraPower is a nuclear energy company that Bill Gates started, a very liberal person who has a very globalist view, who worked with the governor of Wyoming and the Democrats and Republicans there to put a next-generation nuclear facility in a town that a coal plant was already shutting down. And so now you have local know-how in the energy industry that can easily transition from one plant to another, and they can keep their livelihoods, they can get paid even more, and they can be a part of the next generation future for American energy. Bill Gates, the guy who is all about global solutions, is relying on local knowledge in Wyoming to make his next generation nuclear plant successful. And then the last principle that Richard Nixon had that I think is important is that he did have an American exceptionalism principle to everything that he did. America does have better standards and does produce energy and protect the environment better than anywhere else in the world. I don't think that we should be shy about that, and Richard Nixon wasn't either. He knew that we needed to make improvements and that we wanted to be the shining star at the top of the hill that other countries look to. That means consistently improving even though we're the best. When we are exporting all of our technologies, clean, dirty, whatever, overseas, we are all losing for many, many reasons. But thankfully, I'm starting to see a shift in that mindset. I just toured a solar manufacturing facility in Ohio. It's a rural town about an hour outside Columbus that within 8 months has gone from 24 employees to 1,000 employees. They are the biggest solar manufacturer in the United States. They are only selling their solar panels to American companies in American states, and they're trying to take this industry back. They also are paying their employees 15% more than the jobs in their area because there's so much money going into that industry. In northern Arizona, where I live, 6 hours north of Phoenix and Scottsdale, I went down 1,500 feet in a uranium mine in a tiny little shaft. It was really fun for me. And they had all these tunnels where they were mining uranium. And they were shipping that uranium from Arizona to Utah, where they were going to process it, and then go to Illinois for the final part of the process. They are single-handedly, it took 35 years to build the thing because of all the regulations in America, but they're single-handedly powering our nuclear plants in the United States with United States uranium. And the people there are so proud to be working for an industry that's a part of that solution. So to recap, it's evolutionary, not revolutionary. It's innovation, not regulation. It's any of the above, not picking winners and losers. It's community first, government last, and it's focusing on American exceptionalism. Those are the policy attributes that Richard Nixon had when he was president of the United States. And that approach ensured affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And when you combine all of those things, I'll say it again, affordability, reliability, and sustainability, that will actually achieve the outcomes that we need in this country. And that also brings a bipartisan consensus to the table because everyone wins and the solutions work for everyone. As I'm standing up here, and I started with all the negative things that are going on, I released a book about 4 months ago, feels like 4 years ago, where I've toured about 75 different cities so far since April. My girlfriend doesn't like me too much for that. But room by room, I've seen that that's the approach that people want. People in America are ready for a modern era of the Richard Nixon environmental approach. Because people are sick of the divisiveness. They're sick of issues like the environment being roped into culture wars, and they want results. Because this sort of approach is an environmentalism that people know works. It's simultaneously centered on human flourishing, economic growth, and the protection of nature, and that it works for every community in this country, not just urban communities, but not just rural communities, not just rich communities, not just poor communities, not just black, not just brown, not just white. It doesn't matter. These approaches work for everyone. And this environmentalism, this brand of environmentalism, most importantly to me, taps into the deep connection that we have with nature. It's something that each one of us has a connection to. And instead of associating environmentalism with a certain brand of politics, it associates environmentalism with the environment again, which is why we haven't been able to see Americans agree on environmental issues for the last few decades. But that's the brand of environmentalism that Nixon stood for. And with the critical crossroads we're at today, it's a brand new environmentalism that we must embrace again. Because I think I can speak for all of us here tonight that we're sick of every issue, especially the environment, being caught up in the culture wars, like I said. But as you've heard, it wasn't always this way, and it doesn't need to be. I know and you know that our greatest achievements in this country have come from the toughest of times, and I believe the sensible approach to environmentalism that I unveiled here tonight and just touched on is the key to unlocking the next era of American greatness and American achievements. Because if America re-injects environmentalism with pragmatism, with unlikely allies standing together to make it nonpartisan again, with human prosperity at the forefront, and with our shared love of the environment as the anchor, we'll unlock the brighter, cleaner future that we all desire, and the one that Richard Nixon knew we all deserved. Thank you.
All right, we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come to you and give you the mic. But first, we have some questions from our socials.
Sure.
First one being, for the future generation that might not know where to start with conservation, what's your advice to them?
I always tell young people because, so I testified at Congress with Greta in 2019, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist. And there's a subset of young people who do believe that the world's going to end. But there's a lot of young people who care deeply about climate change and the environment who've completely tapped out because they think, oh, if it's that bad, then we're all screwed. Why would I even partake in that dialogue? What I tell young people is that we don't need a revolutionary approach that solves everything overnight. We need to take step by step, just like I was alluding to with the to-do list. We just need to start being more efficient in our day-to-day lives, wasting less, being more conscious, embracing new technologies when it's right for us, when the time's right, when the price is right, and advocating for policies that help us get there in a way that's not going to cost humanity. Because I think a lot of young people who, they could be liberal, conservative, or they might not even have a political viewpoint, they feel like, oh wow, it's like the Green New Deal and we need to have these like massive policy changes that overhaul every part of human life or nothing. I'm just gonna go to my job and, drink a beer on the weekends with my friends and forget about it. And that's what we can't have. Because there's a small subset of people who are dominating the narrative with fear-mongering and like revolutionary tactics, but most people don't want that, and we need more of the people who have that evolutionary approach to be active and be pushing for those slow but very helpful changes.
Great. Our next question is nuclear energy safe for Earth, i.e. nuclear waste?
Well, you know how I feel, because I said I wish we had 1,000 nuclear plants. So without scaring anybody, I mean, I've stood as far from nuclear waste as you and I are right now. And I have my own problems, but I don't think any of them come from nuclear fuel. I think the fear-mongering about nuclear waste and nuclear fuel is completely understandable because of historical events that are obvious. But the technology has proven for the last 3 to 4 decades that it is by far the safest energy source of all. There are the least deaths associated per capita in terms of nuclear versus the other energy sources. It's tied with wind. It's like 0.1 per 100,000. And you know, when you're mining for the materials for wind and solar, when you're doing that for coal, when you're doing, you know, drilling for oil, these are very dangerous jobs. That kills way more people, and I'm not trying to fearmonger that, because we obviously need those energy sources. But that's way more dangerous than nuclear fuel is. And I, like I said, have stood as close as you and I are, not only to open nuclear waste, which you can be around and not have a huge problem as long as it's not for a very long period of time, but when I was down in the uranium mine, we didn't wear any hazmat suits or anything. The radioactivity, if you worked in the mine right next to the uranium all day, every day, was the equivalent of being an airline pilot for your entire life. And no one's really worried about that. And those are the people who are down there in the mines every single day. So we have to be careful with uranium and nuclear waste to make sure that there isn't too much exposure or some sort of disastrous event. But all that is preventable, and even with the limited technology we have on nuclear waste, it's proven to be the safest.
Next question. How much does climate change is caused by humans, or is it just nature running its course?
It's a great question. There's no perfect answer to that, because there's no like percentage. No scientist would ever say that. I'll preface this by saying most scientists will say that they're frustrated more by the alarmists than they are by the people who would be thought of as deniers, because the deniers are obviously just saying it's not real. People know where they stand. The alarmists are misattributing the science that they are working so hard to create, saying that the world's going to end when they're publishing reports that do not say that at all. And what climate change science says is that human activity causes changes in our weather. The changes in our weather would happen naturally as well. We are accelerating the changes that we're seeing, and that we should basically, every report that has been put out there, at least in my lifetime, has said that we just need to decrease our reliance on fossil fuels, and that we should be trying to reduce carbon emissions to certain levels. But it does not say we need to ban them. It does not say that the world's going to end. And so there's been a lot of fear-mongering that has made people feel like climate science isn't real, when that's maybe not what it says. A perfect example of this actually was, I was supposed to be on the #1 climate podcast this week. I was supposed to be on it this morning, and they kicked me off of it because they read on page 4 of my book, I guess. I didn't even, they helped me figure out which page it was on. That I said that cold snaps, extreme cold, was supposed to decrease according to climate science, and that when Texas and other places have these extreme cold events, that should not be blamed on climate change. They said that was me denying climate change existed, and that I was lying intentionally. And I literally responded to them saying, I appreciate that you want to be factual. Here's the IPCC UN report from 2 months ago that says that is not expected to happen. And the fact that, let's just say I was intentionally lying. The fact that you don't want to have that debate on your show, or even just say, hey, Benji, we saw this in your book and, wanted to get your thoughts on why you think this is what we've seen and we don't agree. There is a group of people that is suppressing the science that everyone has grown to basically have disdain for, and created a false view on what the science actually says. And that example of the podcast is a perfect answer. So I'm venting at this point, but hopefully I can send this to my therapist. So we can skip that part next time. But it's definitely a real thing. Humans are definitely contributing to it. But I think even if you don't believe that's true, decreasing our reliance on one energy source and making it more diverse for everyone and making it cheaper for everyone to live their lives, that's the future I want. And that's why I can even find alignment with people who don't believe it's real.
Great. Our next question is over here.
Hi, Benji.
Hi.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you for talking about California's policies. I'm a geologist myself, work in the oil and gas industry up in Bakersfield, and I've seen firsthand how this is affecting the oil and gas industry and the people in Bakersfield. My question, obviously we know that nuclear energy is one of the best paths forward for conservation. How do we deal with the fear-mongering around it? Is it education? Is it teaching people about other methods of nuclear energy, like thorium nuclear energy, or how do we do that?
Well, I think it's thank you for the question, and thanks for saying that. I definitely think that it's just normalizing it in the culture more. Like The Simpsons and all these different, cultural things have made such a negative stain on nuclear, and I don't even know if that was intentional, really. It's just, they could make a bit out of it, and that's the way it was. But it's not that green, gooey, scary thing, and if it was, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. I would be way beneath the ground because I've been so close to it. So, I think if we have more, even AOC visited a nuclear plant recently, and I will give her credit for very little. But when she did that, I think it was really helpful because she said that she still was skeptical of it, but that it wasn't as dangerous as she thought it was. I think we need to have more pop culture people, maybe not as, crazy as, polarizing as AOC. But I only have the platform that I have, and so if I tweet that out, it'll only go to that many people. I think we need to have more celebrities, more politicians, more people who have influence going and sharing that this is not scary. And there's a Miss America from last year has spent a lot of time doing a lot on nuclear, and she's a nuclear engineer. She's very prominent now in the nuclear space, has built a platform for herself. You're starting to see Cory Booker and some prominent Democrats endorse nuclear. Even Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. For the first time in my lifetime, nuclear energy is supported by both candidates running for office. So I think we're starting to get there, but it's going to be a cultural change. It's not going to be a policy change because Bill Gates, thankfully he invested in that plant in Wyoming, but he was going to invest billions of dollars in building nuclear in China because he just thought the Americans weren't ready for it here. And thankfully the renaissance of people starting to wake up to the importance of nuclear started to happen, and so now he's investing it here. But we can't be telling business not to invest in the United States because the culture is scared of it, and so I think the cultural normalization of it's the most important thing, and telling people, even if it's your friends and family, this is something that is a no-brainer, and nuclear is not going to be the only energy source in the future, but it is absolutely, I think, one of the most important things to focus on right now.
Next question over here.
Thank you. I moved here, actually.
I love your shirt.
Thank you, appreciate that.
I wish I was wearing that one. Okay.
Moved here about a week ago.
Awesome. From where?
From Utah.
Okay.
For college, so yeah, in my first year there. I just, straightforward question, what can I do to get involved with environmentalism on, without kind of going to the wackier side of the aisle and with what you do?
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that, and we need we need 1,000 more nuclear plants. We need 10 million more views, so thank you. We have a membership program, American Conservation Coalition, and we have college campus chapters and community chapters that aren't just for college students. So I'll get your information and pass you on to our Western Regional Director. I'm also going to launch a nonprofit in a few months here called Nature is Nonpartisan, and I'm co-founding it with a left-of-center person. We have a one-for-one liberal conservative board with some pretty prominent names that, if you follow along, you'll see. That will be a campaign to basically normalize this issue being nonpartisan, highlight stories of bipartisan action, and use grassroots people like you to advocate for sensible action. And so ACC is dedicated to getting conservatives to the table, and this is going to be meant to kind of bridge the divide. So I'd love to have you involved with both, or one or the other.
Question over here.
Thank you. Oh, can I not hold it? Sorry. Okay.
You're not allowed.
don't touch the mic. First of all, agree completely with what you're saying, and super thankful that you're here and speaking up. I'm a professor and I teach environmental science,
Oh my
US
gosh.
policy, and it is
Thank
very. Did you say thank you?
Yeah.
Did you thank me.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's hard, and it's saddening to see such. You're gonna have to hold this for a minute. Are you okay? All right. It's sad for me to see these students that I have so conflicted, and it's not necessarily over the knowledge, it's over,
Right.
like, we're talking about the alarmism versus the denial. I personally feel in a lot of my studies, I've read, diverse papers, and a lot of the scientists at the end will say, we have all this amazing data, and this is great, but if we can't get people to care or
Right.
to have conversations or to be engaged, then this is really all for nothing or limited. And so I would propose maybe at this point, and I'm just curious how you feel, that maybe a missing component of this conservative environmentalist approach right now is this, I don't know if it's a curriculum creation or it's
Right.
this bridging of this conversation to allow students and young minds the freedom to be open to having new ideas like in this book without this, polarizing of themselves in the process or being looked upon negatively by the current cool trends in environmentalism right now. It's almost like they need to have the ability to be brave and have this opportunity given to them.
Yes.
And so I don't even know if I have a question in this. Maybe that
No,
was
that's
more me
really helpful.
expressing. But yeah, if that's something you're interested in, let me know.
I would love to.
But also, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think that that's something in this new era that should be integrated into conservation?
First of all, thank you again, because we need a lot more good teachers in general, but obviously on this issue, we could use a lot of sensibility in the classroom, and so thank you for what you're doing, and you're doing more important work than I am. But that being said, I think honestly the problem that we're facing right now is that anything that doesn't fit the narratives that are existing in society is kind of shut down. I've been kicked off Face the Nation 6 times since on the docket since releasing the book. Hopefully the 7th time is the charm. The podcast, it's the second podcast, big podcast that's done that. I've also had Fox News not have me on when I sent over the talking points, and they saw that I wasn't going to just bash the left. So I think, it is hard to get this information out there because it doesn't fit those divisive narratives. I'd be way more successful. I'd be in a much bigger room if I was doing that. So I think that's the real problem, and that's why I think room by room it has to change, in person by person, because I can't. If I tweet something out and it goes to 1,000 people, and someone else is tweeting something way more divisive, and it's the same topic or whatever, and it's getting 1 million views, I can't compete with that. I can't compete with the algorithm and the audience trends. But what I can do is hopefully leave each person with a little bit of inspiration of how they can spread that in their own lives. And when you're an educator, you have that immense opportunity with the people that you're with. And so I would love to think through a strategy of how we could do that at scale, and I would love to think that through with you. But I keep saying, and this is the 75th stop, so I'm slowly catching up with the people who can tweet and get 1 million people to answer. But with every stop, people are ready for this, and I think if we can all just kind of go out there and build this mindset, my book's not the only resource out there. There are so many resources out there. The Nature is Nonpartisan thing is meant to kind of popularize this. We're gonna have big influencers who are really well known talk about this in a way that. I was just on Newt Gingrich's podcast, and he sat on a couch with Nancy Pelosi, believe it or not, and it wasn't some weird Rudy Giuliani thing. And they talked about the importance of fighting environmental issues together. I'm trying to recreate that, and so I think it's that cultural normalization, kind of like nuclear, where the sensibility just has to spread, and it's going to take educators with their students, one-on-one conversations, social media, everything to do that.
Multiple hands. I'll start right here, actually.
Thank you. Not touching the mic. I am a renewable energy professional. I am also a former president of my high school Young Republicans Club.
Heck yeah.
You're
one of those
had my
really
Republican card
weirdos.
revoked a couple times over my current career. And I spend a lot of time thinking about agricultural policy in California. And there's a lot lot of California policy that's disingenuous. We don't have to unpack that.
I already tried a little bit.
You did a really good job. And I suppose, I think for the rank and file, talking of narratives, there's not really a big tent option for environmentalism. And so, if you have farmers here in California, if they're not farming, more likely than not, that open land becomes developed.
Right.
And thrown under something polluted.
Totally.
But in the standard environmental narrative right now,
They're the enemy.
farming is the enemy.
Yeah.
Same thing for industrialists here,
Right.
who are already operating to higher environmental standards by remaining in the United States than joining the legislative arbitrage and moving to China.
Totally.
So, I think you can probably see where my mind's at, and, I'm not leading the question here. You can disagree. Where do farmers and manufacturers fit in sort of a new environmentalism of this country?
Totally. And they have to be the center of it. Growing up in Wisconsin, I saw how deeply the farming and ranching community loved the land and how deeply they had a connection to it, way more than the people who post things on their Instagram stories about the environment. There's a real deep, and I post Instagram stories about the environment, so I'm really just putting that down to myself. But the farming community knows how to take care of the environment, especially in America. We do farming so much more efficiently than everywhere else. If we're not farming and ranching in the United States, that demand is being exported somewhere else. Unfortunately, Brazil is taking a lot of that, and they're tearing down the Amazon, and they're doing 1 to 2 years of crops and other resources down there that they're giving us, but then it rains too much and it ruins the soil, and so then they ditch the land, and so you're getting 1 or 2 years of crops and other foods, and you're doing that at the expense of the entire Amazon rainforest, which again, increases emissions because the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the earth. So it's all pretty backwards when we're exporting those things, similar to energy when we're exporting that overseas. One of the things that I've realized is that I consider myself a climate activist, which is very weird as a conservative. It's like me driving a Prius, which I don't drive a Prius. I drive a Mazda hybrid, for the record. But I would drive a Prius. I have no problem with it. I consider myself that because I'm not scared to say that climate change is real, but it's not as bad as what the other side's saying. There's a lot of people for decades who have felt like this fear-mongering has gone over the top, and I'm not going to convince them to be a climate champion tomorrow. That's okay. And what I will say, though, is that they have a love for the land, and we need to tap into that. So that's why this organization is called Nature is Nonpartisan, because it's trying to tap into the love that people have for the environment. You don't even have to believe climate change is real to know that reducing pollution in the atmosphere is a good thing. The things that we're breathing in. China's air comes over here, okay? That's important for us to think about. And so I think making the environment about the environment again and not the politics is really critical. And I'm trying to destigmatize climate, and that's why it's mentioned in the book. That's why I talk about it, because I don't think it needs to be stigmatized. But farmers, hunters, fishermen and women, fossil fuel workers, it's a big chunk of the country that partakes in either those things for their job or for pleasure. And those people need to be at the center of this environmental movement.
All right, we have time for one last question, but he will stick around and sign books, so if you have any more questions, just head on in the room. But last question here.
So unlike these other people, I'm not really an expert in things. I have a psychology degree right now, so that's not really my area of expertise.
Sure.
But because of that, I still do want to learn more about this. But because of all of the weird information stuff going around, especially online, the political devices, how would you recommend the non-expert person to learn more about things like the policies, the restrictions, or just the science behind it?
It's a really good, probably the most critical question so far, because the way that we consume information is, what makes us who we are. And, you look at, my parents and grandparents' generations who are really scared about different things than my generation is, and they both are scared about things that I know, are largely overblown or whatever. So it is probably the most important question. How do we consume information that gets us knowledge on this without feeding into that? I would say start with the local issues that are, important. Like in Arizona, water conservation is huge, and the ozone and the air pollution in the valley is a really big problem. And Whether or not we keep natural gas plants open and nuclear plants open is a big problem. But those are different realities than maybe like Washington, where I used to live. They're dealing with more rainfall in the summer. It's just different. And so getting involved with a local issue, it's a little bit easier to parse through the divide because local organizations and politicians and so on tend to have a little bit less bias. They don't have huge followings. They might have 500 followers on Instagram for a local nonprofit. But those are the ways that you can actually make the biggest impact and actually learn about things that are tangible. I'm trying to create platforms for that alongside partners. Like I said, we're fighting uphill because we're dealing with the current algorithms and divide. Our website, ACC's website, has a lot of resources on nuclear, and we have an academy where we have, I think, hopefully fairly digestible courses that are like 20 minutes in length on different topics. So we're trying to create that for the national issues. But when you can invest in local issues, it's way more fulfilling because you can like go do stuff about it and like be a part of a community of like-minded people. But it also makes a bigger impact than trying to like get something done in Congress, which takes like 20 years to get national parks funded, which we all want, and it's just so dumb that it takes 20 years. So that's what I would suggest. And there is no home. If you ask me, how do I find a home for climate denial or climate alarmism, I've got a ton of websites for you. It's a little bit harder when you're not trying to feed that, but it's possible.
All right, let's get a round of applause here for Benji.
Thank you.
You can purchase a copy of his book just around the corner and then enter through these doors. He'll sign all of them and maybe even take a picture. Fantastic. See you there.